Well, thanks for coming back. 3 lectures in 1 week by one person is a terrible thing to have inflicted upon you, so I appreciate your tolerance for coming back. Okay, so just a kind of quick recap about where we are in the story thus far. So on the lecture on Monday, I talked about Mexico and the history of philosophy and said a little bit about the project. So the project here is roughly to see if I can convince you that there are interesting things in the history of Mexican philosophy. Right, that's the project. And the thing one of the things I was trying to address in that initial lecture was the question about starting points. That is, if we want to tell a story about the history of Mexican philosophy that is a maximally expansive version of the story, where do we begin that story? And so I think there's a natural question to ask whether or not Nahuatl philosophy counts as philosophy and whether or not a story should start there. On Wednesday, we talked about Las Casas en Sepúlveda, Ignorance and Atrocity, and there the focus was trying to walk you through some what I think of as underappreciated issues in that debate. So I think it's just a super interesting debate. It's super complicated, and the pieces go in lots of different directions. Gracias. But of special interest to me were these issues about free will as rational capacities, the competing pictures about moral epistemology, and then just noting just how much stuff is still in those debates that I didn't even really get a chance to touch on. So today the challenge is to say a little bit about Sor Juana, and the question you should be asking yourself is how much trouble will Manuel get in for incorrectly interpreting Sor Juana's work and thereby showing great disrespect to the patrimony of Mexico. So here's una respuesta, pero no la respuesta. Patrimonies are machista. I'm not worried. Okay, so let's go. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. So I take it that if you're in this room, there's a reasonably good chance that you know something about Sor Juana, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about her or her context. This is, if you don't know anything about Sor Juana, then your Mexican card just got revoked. But the basic background is she was a nun. She also worked as the administrator of her convent. She was denied formal education, but she was this massively impressive autodidact. She taught herself an enormous amount of stuff, and with very little formal education and access to education. She came to build a huge library, partly on the backs of a library that she got access to from her grandfather. But the reports of the library at the time at which, at its greatest size, there's disagreement about just how large the library was, but widespread consensus that it may have been the largest privately owned library in the Americas at the time. She was a polymath in a way that you could only be in the 17th century, unless you're Elon Musk. She was a poet, a playwright, wrote songs, wrote a book on music theory, wrote devotional guides. Her poetry was in Spanish and Latin and Nahuatl. She had interest in theology, philosophy, and science. She was just a towering intellect of the 17th century and as easily interesting and remarkable as anyone else in the 17th century in the Americas. I think hands down one of the most impressive intellectual figures that we have in the Americas from that time period. She was involved in court life and in the intellectual circle. So initially she had played a role in the Viceroy's court. She ran in all of the kind of elite intellectual circles of the time and came to have substantial fame. So even when she had entered into the convent, she remained in communication with much of the intellectual and cultural and artistic elite of Mexico City at the time. And her fame was such that she had visibility across the ocean. So she was read, known, and celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic. So here there's a kind of interesting divergence depending on what side of the U.S.-Mexico border you're standing on about what people have read and are familiar with. So I take it that or at least in conversation, when I talk to people here, what comes out is especially the dream or the first dream or Primer Sueño. This is a piece that lots of people have read and know about. It's way less commonly taught in the United States. When people read Sor Juana in the United States, overwhelmingly it's her reply to Sor Filotea, and it's largely in circles that are attempting to think about the kind of proto-feminism or actual feminism involved in Sor Juana's work. So I think, despite the fact that there's lots of obvious philosophical interests in her work, and despite the fact of very wide readership in Spanish, there are several barriers to the wider reception of her work as a philosopher. That is, I take it that she's widely recognized as a poet, and lots of people read her as a poet. It is less common that people read her as a philosopher. That's one of the things that I'm going to do today, is to read her as a philosopher. And I think there are a couple of barriers to why people are less inclined to read her as a philosopher. So one of them is just, at least in the academic world that I run around in, partly it's just a matter of her intellectual influences. That she was deeply entrenched in reading Latin literature, that she was familiar with scholastic theology, that she was writing during the Counter-Reformation. All of these things are ways to ensure that you're not a bestseller in the United States. It's also, this is Jorge Gracia's line when he sort of asked the question about whether or not we should think of Sor Juana as a philosopher. He says, well, part of the problem is her style as a humanist, both in her letters and then in the poetry. These things don't tend to count as strictly philosophical in the West. Now here I'm going to just take it that we can just take that conversation we had on Monday about whether or not you can do philosophy in the mode of poetry. I'm just going to take that for granted and assume that that's already part of the tradition. It's something that happens, and we can argue about whether or not that's a good or a bad way to do philosophy, but it's clear that the tradition has people doing philosophy in that mode. Also, obviously the fact that so much of her work is poetry. So this affects both who reads her work, that is, the people likely to read her work are oftentimes going to be people who are interested in the poetry, and it affects how her work tends to get read. So ambitions for today, what I really want to do today is, as I said just a minute ago, I want to contribute to growing discussion that reads Sor Juana as a philosopher. So there's been some interesting recent work on this. Virginia Aspe has a new book that came out last year that is explicitly interested in trying to read the theory of freedom in Sor Juana's work. Sergio here has been writing some essays about these things. Sofia Ortiz at Vassar has been writing about the virtue epistemology in Sor Juana. So there's a growing group of folks who are thinking about Sor Juana as a philosopher. And part of what I want to do is to contribute to that discussion. So what I'm going to do here today is I'm going to highlight some features of her work that I take to be alive, useful, or interesting for contemporary philosophical work. Right, so that's the standard I want these talks to satisfy, such that you could think to yourself, I don't really care at all about the 17th century. Sor Juana, I hate poetry, and I hate the unit of money that her picture is on, and I don't care about Sor Juana at all. I want you to, even if you thought all of that, to by the end of this talk think, oh, there were some interesting things going on in Sor Juana's work. That's the ambition. So more specifically, the goal is to identify some philosophically promising ideas in her work, and two, to advance some new interpretations of some familiar themes in her work. In particular, what I'm going to talk about are some of the things you have to talk about if you're going to read Sor Juana as a philosopher. They include the kind of gender and social construction dimensions of her work. I'm going to focus on some issues in her epistemology, and then I'm going to spend some time focusing on an issue in her philosophical theology. So that's the order we'll do them in. We'll see if we can get through all of these things today.
Would you just here behind, when you were saying the last piece?
Oh, there we go. Okay. Have I been consistently behind?
No.
Okay, just that one. All right. So there we go. That's the plan. Gender and social construction, epistemology, philosophical theology. Okay. All right. On the social construction stuff. So famously, if you want to pick a fight in any time between 1985 and about 2005, just say the word social construction in a room of philosophers and then run, and you will have caused a fight. Or pick anything that's really important and say that's socially constructed, and then run, and you'll get the fight as well. For my purposes, I'll just tell you what I mean by social construction. And if it's not what you mean by social construction, or you think it's a bad way of understanding social construction, then you can just say social construction sub Vargas, right? Just put the little, the subscript on it, and then we can pat ourselves on the back that yet another philosophical problem solved. Okay, so for my purposes, something is socially constructed in the present sense if its status or nature is defined or produced by social practices, social meanings, or norms and expectations about the thing in question. Okay? That's the picture of social construction that I'm going to operate with. All right. Why did I give you a picture of two guys sculpting a statue of a woman? Come on, like we're reading some Sor Juana here. All right, so 3 ideas in Sor Juana's constructivism about gender. So here are the ideas that I think are super interesting in Sor Juana and her account about the kind of constructivism about gender. So she thinks, look, first off, social expectations can create real dispositions in people. So a really important idea for Sor Juana is just the idea that if you have expectations about the way people are going to be, that has real effects on the way in which people come to be produced. Relatedly, expectations about women's gender roles in particular create a double bind. That is, they create a kind of dilemma where there is a no-win situation for women's choices. That's one of the ideas we'll come back to in a moment. I mean, this here is basically the preview of where we're going to end up in a moment. And in the case of gender, our norms for how we assign culpability, that is, who's at fault, reflects social power and not the underlying faults. Right? So here's one way of thinking about it. You might think, look, there's the things that our social practices should track. They should track when somebody really is at fault, and we should blame people when they really are at fault. But part of what Sor Juana's picture is that our actual social practices have become detached from what's plausibly the fault-making features of our fault-making features about the world. That's the claim. Okay, so the one place to start is Redondilla 92. Quick comment here. So most of Sor Juana's poetry was untitled, and the titles it gets and the conventions that get used just come from the first kind of collected edition of her work. Tends to be where the titling of these things come from. And then if you see other titles on the poetry, it's usually something that was placed on by an editor after the fact. Okay, so here's a kind of quick who was educated in Mexico test. If you get a group of people who are educated in Mexico, I have bet with people before that you can find out by asking if there's anybody in the room who can finish the sentence that starts with hombres necios. Okay, so I'm guessing by the laughter that in fact somebody can finish that sentence. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time walking you through something that some of you have memorized. But here is Redondilla number 92, and you can read it in whichever language you like better, or you can just read across the lines and then it'll be really confusing. O foolish men who accuse women with so little cause, not seeing you are the reason for the very thing you blame. For if with unequaled longing you solicit their disdain, why wish them to behave well when you urge them on to evil? The audacity of your mad belief resembles that of a child who devises a monster and then afterwards fears it. Love them for what you can make them, or make them what you can love. Okay, so well-known poem. Here's why we've got to read it. It is super interesting. First thing that's kind of worth observing is this was written more than a century before the earliest philosophical defenses of feminism in the Anglophone world. So Wollstonecraft, Harriet Taylor Mill, and John Stuart Mill are kind of the standard places people anchor the beginnings of philosophical defenses of feminism in the Anglophone world. Sor Juana is making these kinds of arguments significantly before. And her basic position is that women's putative nature is, at least in some significant part, right? So she's not clear about whether or not it's comprehensive or just in this domain, but at least in some significant part, the nature is a product of male-structured social expectations. And this produces, she thinks, that is, so one of the ways you might put it is that, so if males enjoy social power and they're creating norms of expectation and norms that will trap women in, no matter what choices they make, that what you're going to get is this kind of classic double bind or dilemma structure where women face a double demand on the one hand for demands of chastity and on the other hand demands for sexual access. And so she goes on to say explicitly, you think highly of no woman, no matter how modest. If she rejects you, she's ungrateful, and if she accepts, unchaste. So basic upshot here, no matter what a woman chooses, she'll be subject to condemnation, and in contrast, men are left untouched by social practices of condemnation. Now, how cool a trick is that? I mean, that is, you can invent a set of rules such that no matter what the other party does, they're at fault, and you're never at fault. If you figure out how to do that, let me know. It would change my life. Okay, so she goes on. Who carries the greater guilt in a passion gone astray, the woman beseeched who falls, or the man who begged her to yield? which one merits more blame, although both deserve our censure, the woman who sins for pay or the man who pays to sin? But why are you so alarmed by the guilt you plainly deserve? Okay, basic upshot. Men create the double bind, and they enforce it. Even though women are paying for prostitution, women are the ones who pay the social costs for the fact of the practice. And then how guilt is assigned, in this case, reflects social power, not the distribution of moral guilt. Right? So the idea is, look, in these kinds of cases, it's not, interestingly, notice, it's not that she's saying that women aren't guilty at all. Women still bear responsibility for their choices. But she's noting, look, in this kind of social context, it's going to be the case that guilt is not reflecting actual culpability, that is a joint culpability for the action, but rather the culpability is entirely redounding onto women and not affecting men. So she thinks, look, you know, there's at least on a par culpability. But if anything, she seems to suggest greater social power puts greater guilt on those with the power to change the norms. So if you can make a difference, and you can change the way in which people blame and the way in which people address these kinds of things, then on Sor Juana's view, then you're more at fault for letting the situation continue if it's an inegalitarian or unequal or unfair or unjust distribution. All right. Now, of course, Sor Juana's focus is on 17th century Mexico. But when I teach this to my students, they're always astonished that this was written in the 17th century. In fact, I had my daughter read the poem 2 weeks ago, and she was like, oh, that's pretty good. And I said, yeah, isn't it though? It was written by a nun in the 17th century, and her mouth just dropped. So I'm told that the issue remains alive in some way, shape, or form today. But it's also true, I think, and this is one of the things I think that makes these thoughts philosophically interesting, is that the issue generalizes. That is, it's not uncommon for subordinated populations to face choice sets where all the options are stigmatized, right? So that there are just going to be populations for whom there are no good choices available. And when that happens, especially when that's a case where the subordinated population faces stigma from other parties, external parties, then you've got the basic configuration of what Sor Juana is diagnosing in the poem. Now, as I noted before, these facts don't fully exculpate women. On Sor Juana's view, the view is not that women don't bear responsibility for their choices. She's very upfront about this. She thinks, look, women still have responsibility for their choices. It's just they shouldn't be the unique bearers of the choices they're making under conditions that are unfair about what kinds of opportunities that are available. The way I would put this is something like in terms of the quality of opportunities. If you provide women with only opportunities that are stigmatized for them in some or another domain, then it's going to be the case that, yes, they still are responsible for the choice they're making, but the layer and level of that blame or guilt, that culpability, looks like it's going to have to be diminished if that choice set was created in a way that could be changed and altered by people who have social power. Right? That's the general thought. Okay, so far so good? All right, that's Sor Juana 101, right? So that if you read Sor Juana, you should at least get this much out of it. And if you don't get this much out of it when you read Sor Juana, you're doing it wrong, right? Okay, now some of you are about to throw things at me because I've already now declared my bad Sor Juana interpretation. Okay, so further notes. So one of the things that I think is interesting here, I'm just going to list a couple other things that I think are interesting about some of her poetry that got, I think, philosophical import to them. So I touched on this at the outset, the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies of social expectations. So this is the idea that we saw in that poem about, well, look, part of the reason women have the kinds of characters that they do is because these characters grow up in response to the opportunities and incentives that are made available to them. So social norms and pressures create this kind of thing. And you might think, look, this is just going to be true for populations in general. This is not a unique to women feature. It's a unique to human beings feature, it turns out, that we are responsive to the kinds of opportunities that are put in front of us and what the structure of incentives is. Obviously, I'm not going to pursue this point, but obviously this dovetails in ways with debates about how we think about how human dispositions are made. So think about the Sepúlveda and Las Casas debate and about the idea about whether or not one's social and cultural context structures up your agency in one or another way. But the other thing I think is interesting about Sor Juana's poem, and part of, I think, the kind of mastery of the poetic argument, is that she concludes on an interestingly bittersweet note. she suggests the possibility of improvement, right? Towards the very end of the poem, as you saw, she has this line, love them for what you can make them, or make them what you can love. Right? So it's a kind of challenge. That is, if we find that we've got subordinated populations with bad choice sets, and we're not happy and inclined to stigmatize anything they do, then part of the answer here is, well, so restructure the choice sets, restructure the social fabric that creates the context in which the choices arise. All right. So that's going to be it for what I want to say about that particular poem. And I touch on it not because I think that's particularly innovative, the things I just said, but rather because I think this is an important part of the context of understanding why, when people have found Sor Juana philosophically interesting, why a number of people have thought that she was very interesting, because she anticipates, in a lot of ways, ideas that one finds in downstream debates. There's a lot of other philosophical themes in Sor Juana's work, and the literature on these kinds of things, the sort of wider literature on Sor Juana's work, especially Primer Sueño, is substantial. So José Gaos, for example, I have to give him a shout out because I'm here giving these lectures with his name on it. He's got a particularly interesting and important one, El Sueño de un Sueño, in which he unpacks some of the architecture about what's going on in Primer Sueño, but virtually everybody who's written seriously about Sor Juana has at some point or another tried to engage with the contents of Primer Sueño. I'm not going to talk about that here today, but I just want to flag it because I think it's an important part of the Sor Juana corpus. Okay, so let's move to stuff that I think is less widely discussed in the Sor Juana literature. And so these are going to be epistemic themes. And I'm going to break the epistemic themes up into two parts. So the first bit of epistemic themes, and this is why I started with the social construction and feminism ideas, emerges again in the context of what might sometimes get called a feminist epistemology, or in a wider, more capacious sense, tied into issues in social epistemology. Okay, la respuesta. So this is the kind of text that everybody looks to when you want to mine Sor Juana for philosophical arguments. And the context of this text is a matter of ongoing dispute. So that is how we should understand what it was that she was doing, what the context was in which she was writing this, and so on. There's a lot of dispute about this kind of thing, and I'm not going to have a lot to say about it, because I take it that this is work for historians, not philosophers who write about free will and moral responsibility and moral psychology to solve. So I await the verdicts of history on the particulars of some of these kinds of things. But lots of folks have written about them. You know, Pass wrote this book that everybody has to read, and then lots of folks came afterwards to argue that parts of the book were inaccurate about these things. Here's what I take to be the uncontroversial bits of the history. So Sor Juana writes this thing in 1690. She writes this critique of a sermon by a Portuguese Jesuit, the sermons by Vieira. And so she writes this, she kind of launches these criticisms, and somebody asks her to write it up. And eventually it makes its way over to Manuel Fernández de Santa Cruz, the Bishop of Puebla, who publishes it. There's disagreement about whether or not she knew it was going to get published, and whether or not it was done against her will. I don't take a stand on any of these issues, but it gets published along with a letter from the bishop that is a pseudonymous letter. It's signed by Sor Filotea. And the letter, in some sense, the contents of the letter recommend that Sor Juana spend more time doing theological things and less time doing non-theological things. And then in 1691, Sor Juana writes this super important piece, the Respuesta de Sor Filotea. And interestingly, I just note this because this is one of the kinds of things that has emerged over the past couple decades of the literature. It turns out people keep finding more Sor Juana stuff. So go look in your abuelita's basement. There might be a Sor Juana letter in there. So Sor Juana writes this, there's these interesting parallels between the arguments in La Respuesta, the 1691 piece, and then the earlier 1681 piece that she wrote to her then confessor, Antonio Núñez de Miranda, who was also a Jesuit, where she basically tells him off and says, you know what, I'm going to exercise my right to dismiss you as my confessor, and she does. Right? And they have a falling out. And it's interesting because of the parallels between these two pieces. All right. Some initial observations about this. If you haven't read La Respuesta. Actually, I'll just ask, how many people have never read La Respuesta? Okay, so this is amazing. Okay, this is why I've come to proselytize to you. So I've come to share the good news. This is a masterpiece. You've got to read this thing. It's an amazing bit of writing. And it's just this really interesting, complicated, subtle bit of writing. And just whether you like philosophy or not, it's just as a piece of kind of intricate argumentative architecture. It's just an astonishing piece. Okay, so some of the contents. She carefully avoids framing her position as revolutionary, right? So she's going to end up arguing for some fairly revolutionary things in the piece. But because she's not stupid, she writes the piece in such a way that almost nothing she's saying she presents as, oh, and here's a big revolutionary or innovative idea. It's always couched in how this is consistent with a tradition, how she is part of an upshot of a big community of people doing these things, how commitments that are already existing internal to the Catholic Church or internal to social practices or internal to various commitments of her interlocutor, that all of these things produce the grounds for her to argue for the things that she's doing. Now, the defense of women's right to education, that's the thing that this piece is probably best known for, and it's the thing that stands out most for contemporary audiences, right? So the date of this piece in the late 17th century, it's kind of startling and notable about how clear and vigorous the defense is of a woman's right to education as a kind of purely historical piece. But there are a number of other interesting things going on in the piece that I want to turn our attention to now. So one is her epistemic picture, and two are some themes about mitigation and culpability. So Juana's super fascinated by mitigation and culpability. It just shows up again and again in her writing in different poems and in her various letters. So here's a quick overview of La Respuesta. So she starts off by accepting Fernandez's admonition that she attend more to spiritual matters and less to popular and secular interests, right? So she's a good nun. She immediately replies to this condemnation from the bishop, and she says, sure, I'll do as you say. But then she proceeds to defend all of her past conduct on grounds that it was almost always at the behest of others. So she says, yeah, you're telling me that I should stop writing these things, these popular pieces, and stop writing all these other kinds of interesting things, but the reason why I was writing love poetry and silly songs and crazy plays and all this other stuff is because other people kept asking me to do it. And what was I supposed to do? I mean, I was just doing what they asked me to do. I'm a good, obedient nun. But then she goes on to run this very interesting argument where she says, look, she says, but part of why I was doing what I was doing was because I have an overwhelmingly powerful inclination to study everything, right? Because it's all of her, as it were, secular learning, and not just the artistic stuff, but her interest in the sciences and in philosophy and various other kinds of things that are part of the bishop's condemnation. Now, the reason why this is interesting and important is partly against the background injunction that nuns, especially after the Council of Trent, were supposed to live in a state of blessed ignorance. And in particular, her former confessor, Núñez de Miranda, had written up a manual about how nuns are supposed to conduct themselves. And amongst other things, he says, one of the things that nuns are supposed to do is renounce their will and freedom. Right? Renounce their will and freedom. So when you take on the habit and you enter into a convent, your will is no longer your own. You're supposed to obey the edicts of your religious superiors. This is why her interest in studying has to be presented as she argues, divinely inspired and in some sense kind of out of her control. It's a kind of divine pathology is the way she runs the argument. Now, quick footnote here, there's some scholastic terminology she's very careful to invoke. So the idea of an inclination in scholastic theology has a particular significance where it's supposed to be tied into some proper good or proper function in something. And she needs to make an argument that that her impulse to study isn't just that she's willing to do bad things or willing to disobey requirements by her superiors or by the bishop. Instead, what she needs is an argument that somebody who's got more power and more hierarchy than the bishop has ordered her to do these things. And where are you going to find that? will just go up the chain of divinity. If you stop at God and say it's God imposed, then it doesn't matter what the bishop thinks, right? So she needs a story about why this is plausible as a kind of deep inclination in her, rather than just some willful misuse of her own reason or will. So ostensibly, the function of the autobiography is to make plausible this thing I'm calling the divine pathology. She doesn't actually call it the divine pathology, but she presents it very much in a way that we 21st century readers would read it as a kind of divine pathology. And in order to make that argument stick, the idea that it's an inclination, not just willful misbehavior, is it has to turn out that she is well suited for learning, no matter the barrier. And it has to turn out her inclination is not an isolated thing. It's not like a one-off where one time she thought to herself, oh no, I shouldn't really have an extra piece of chocolate cake, and then goes and has the chocolate cake. It's not like a weakness of will case, and it's not like iterated weakness of will. Rather, it's supposed to be, look, there's this deep and powerful and fundamental drive, and we know it's an inclination not just because it's pervasive, but because she's actually well suited to live out and act on this drive. So that's what these two pieces matter about what's going on in the architecture of the piece. Now, okay, that's the ostensive structure. So if you read La Respuesta, that's all the stuff that will jump out at you the first time you read the piece. But inside that autobiography, this is really the part that I love so much. Inside that autobiography, it's a Trojan horse. It's a Trojan horse that is filled with a bunch of prescient work in social epistemology. That is, there's a bunch of work in this thing that just anticipates all kinds of things that happen in 21st century analytic social epistemology. And that's what I'm going to convince you about, or that's what I'm going to try anyway. We'll see. And the other thing is, there's an interesting argument, I think, about the limits of theology. So how does that go? Well, that's coming attraction. I'll tell you more in August. No, okay. So Sor Juana on the social conditions of learning. So here's what Sor Juana says. In doing her autobiography, along the way, she's telling a story. She tells a story about her own life, but it's a story with a purpose. There's an interesting argument embedded in it, and it goes something like this. It's all couched in autobiographical terms because, of course, it's supposed to be the story of her life to justify that she has an inclination and not just willful misbehavior. But she says, look, learning is social. Soulless books alone are an inefficient way to learn. Teachers are required to identify what to read and to explain the meanings of texts. That's why here less so, but I guess it's here true too. That's why folks everywhere are paying for education in some way, shape, or form, right? Because there are lots of libraries out there, and you can go read those libraries anytime you want. You can go read the books in the library. But the reason why we want to go into classrooms and talk about these things is, amongst other things, teachers help identify what we need to read and to explain the meanings of texts. And then she says, but look, learning works best if you have access to peers to practice with and to consult with. That is, don't think that we're isolated atomistic knowers who just somehow can absorb information on our own. We require social community to do it in. And if you don't have that social community there and you're doing it by yourself, there's a pretty good chance you're doing it badly. Then she effectively argues for the Wollstonecraft. She plagiarizes Wollstonecraft 100 years before Wollstonecraft lived. She says one of the things that we need is a room of one's own. That is, she emphasizes the need to be free of distractions and demands if you're going to do serious study and you're going to seriously try to understand the complicated features of the world. Last, she says, there's also a basic material condition. You need access to the relevant texts. If you don't have the relevant texts, good luck studying. Right? That's the thought. Now, she's going to end up walking that last bit back a little bit, because it's going to turn out that one of the things she argues is that even if you don't have access to texts, as that she was banned at several points in time from reading. It's just amazing. Banned from reading. Please, somebody ban me from reading. She was banned from reading, and she notes that even though she was banned from reading, it did little to stop her interest in learning and little to stop her ability to discover things about the world. So we're going to come back to that in a moment. So here's the insight. She says, informal and speculative, so that there's an insight, though, that she says that falls out of a lot of this kind of stuff. It was an artifact of her education. She was forced to learn stuff on her own, and she said she discovered something about how to effectively learn. She says, in formal and speculative areas, so not technical areas, in formal and speculative areas, there are advantages to spreading one's efforts and attentions across subject matters. Here's the quote One subject illuminates and opens a path in another by means of variations in hidden connections so that it seems that they correspond and are joined in unity and harmony. This is part of a larger argument that she gives about what we now might call network effects. So that is, the more subjects you know about, the more you can readily learn other subjects. So part of her admonition is, be wary of narrow education. Narrow education creates bad knowers. They're inefficient learners, and they don't know as much stuff as they ought to know. All right, this so far is just setup or prelude to the real argument. So this is a prelude to an argument about how knowledge is gendered. And this is, I think, one of the more delightful pieces about how this argument goes. So she says the following. So here it says the argument for gendered knowledge, by which, here, just to be clear, when I say gendered knowledge, what I mean is knowledge is gendered in the sense that gender roles partition the possibility of certain kinds of knowledge. So when I talk about knowledge being gendered, that's what I mean. And I say, look, so here's the Sor Juana argument. Sor Juana says, look, certain social and institutional roles are gendered. Right? So in her world, only men could become professors, and women couldn't. Only men could be priests, women couldn't. And there were then going to be a variety of gendered roles that only women could do that men couldn't do. And she says, okay, given the social fact about the way social and institutional roles are gendered, knowledge tied to these roles is partitioned by gender. There's just going to be certain kinds of things you can only learn about and know if you're a member of that gendered class, because you're just not going to have exposure to the relevant bits of knowledge and experiences and practices that the gender categories close off to you. Right? So I will never know what it's like to be harassed on the metro. Right? It's unlikely to happen to me because my gender and the way our society is built precludes the possibility of that readily happening. If, however, and this is a crucial piece, right? She's a good Catholic, committed to natural law theory, thinks the universe is structured and organized. If, however, you think the world has a unity to it, that is, you think the world is integrated and all parts of the world, as she just suggested, have overlapping patterns, or you think we understand things better by drawing from wider bodies of knowledge, that's what I was calling Sor Juana's insight about theoretical learning, then you should think that gendered social roles inhibit the full development and transmission of human knowledge. Because it's just going to turn out that we dudes aren't going to know certain things that we should know and that we could know that would tell us something about the architecture of the entire universe, because there are things that we will never do because of our gender. And in the reverse direction, there are going to be things that women know that men won't know and will never know, so long as a world is structured and built around gender, because there are access to some features about the world that just won't show up in the experience of men. And so here's the passage where she lays this out. What could I tell you, Señora? Here, this is Sor Filotea, i.e. Manuel Fernandez, the bishop. What could I tell you, Señora? And notice, this is an enactment of the very thing, right? The bishop is all like, writing it as a woman. And she's like, woman to woman, let me tell you something. Okay? Sor Juana is so good. What could I tell you, Señora, about the natural secrets I have discovered when cooking? And she knows the bishop has never cooked in his life. Seeing that an egg set and fries in butter or oil, but falls apart in syrup, seeing that for sugar to remain liquid, it is enough to add a very small amount of water in which a quince or another bitter fruit has been placed, what can we women know but kitchen philosophies? As Lupercio Leonardo so wisely said, one can philosophize very well and prepare supper. And seeing these minor details, she's really turning the knife here, minor details, i.e. a whole class of things that the bishop will never know about, that Sor Juana is telling him, woman to woman. I say that if Aristotle had cooked, he would have written a great deal more. Right? The argument is that there's stuff Aristotle didn't write about because he was a dude living his dudely life in Athens, and he wasn't going into the kitchen. And he could have written, rather than stopping at the physics and then moving on to the metaphysics, he could have done the physics to the chemistry, right? But he didn't. Because he never got into a kitchen. And so part of her point is that the possibility of synoptic knowledge and of seeing how the full complexity of the world hangs together, good luck getting that if you're only living a little part of the world and it's an artificial part of the world. We've artificially partitioned the world according to gender. Okay. Not that they're, and by this what I mean is artificially partition the knowledge bits of the world by gender. Right? That's the worry. Okay, she says, but interestingly, she takes up the question about whether or not there's a better way, right? So she doesn't just end by wagging her finger at the bishop. She's got a few extra things to say because Sor Juana always has more to say. So Sor Juana says, look, women should have a more prominent role in a variety of intellect-dependent domains. And so she goes on to list just a legion of domains under which women could be more involved in and would bring with them bodies of knowledge and access to bodies of knowledge that men don't have. And so she talks about law, she talks about theology, she talks about various issues of philosophy, where this is understood as natural philosophy. And she notes, look, what we need are older women as learned as Lita. And the thought here is what we need a class of educated women who can go and teach in schools and pass on that knowledge. Why would we want that? Well, it turns out in the 17th century there was a problem that surely disappeared in the 21st century that involves lecherous male instructors taking advantage of young women students. So apparently it turns out this was a problem back then. And so she says, look, we can just solve this. If we just have women instructors, women professors, the problem goes away. That's the claim. I'm just telling you what she says. Don't get mad at me. Okay, so actuality is proof of possibility. That is, she says, and not only is it like, this isn't just a raw potentiality, but in fact, there's a tradition of women learned in law and theology and so on. And she repeatedly reminds her readers throughout this thing. She just name drops name after name after name about other women who've done this, which suggests that it's possible and suggests that an alternative conception about how knowledge transmission happens is available. Okay, so there are a bunch of other features of the text. I'll just quickly hit them and move on because we're running out of time and I want to make sure that I subject you to some philosophical theology. Okay, so one is an early version of gaslighting is actually in this text. So gaslighting is just the idea of when a trusted person manipulates another person, typically a woman, into self-doubt about their sanity. Like, no, honey, I'm not cheating on you. You're just going crazy. Those strange calls I'm getting at 2 in the morning, they have nothing to do with the affair. So that's supposed to be a kind of issue about gaslighting. And Sor Juana notes that the most hurtful effects of attacks on her were not by her enemies, but her friends, when they told her that her intelligence would make her lost in vain and that her studies would damage her. She also emphasizes a lost tradition of women intellectuals. And there's this recurring suggestion, I'm not going to spend much time talking about this, but it shows up in a lot of the discussions, especially of Primer Sueño, about the idea that maybe intellectual abilities aren't sexed. And this is crucial in order for making sense about why a gendered social world is bad for knowledge propagation and knowledge production. That is, all rational intellects work as rational intellects. Think they may be embodied in importantly different ways, but the functioning of the intellect works. It works irrelevant of whether or not you're in one body or another. And this actually comes out explicitly in her letter to Núñez. So I'm not going to read the whole thing there, but she's very explicit about, look, why are people forbidding women from private and individual study? They have rational souls just as men, and goes on in that vein before she fires them. Okay, so Sor Juana's anticipation of later feminist thought, sorry for the edit problem here on that, is expansive. So we get a defense of women's education, the full rationality of women, the need for social conditions that enable learning and studying, and the cost of a gendered world for knowledge, and something like an early proto-version of gaslighting, and last, a buried history of women's intellectual contributions. This is what she argues for in La Respuesta. So all that, and it's just hilarious because she's got great insults along the way. So it's a terrific piece. It's a masterpiece. You should go and read it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and try to get through some of these things, but we may cut it short because we're also running a little long on time here. But I want to float this possibility of a kind of modest theological skepticism, because I take it everything I've said so far should be pretty familiar to Sor Juanistas. So I don't think I've broken a lot of ground on what I've covered there, but what I want to say is an argument that I've not seen in the literature that I think is very interesting, and I'm not totally sold on it myself, but I think it's worth thinking about whether or not there is really this argument in that piece. So let's set the stage. In lots of places, Sor Juana takes shots at men doing theology. Right? She just loves to make fun of guys doing theology, right? So she just says, look, if the reason why women can't study Scripture is that they aren't learned and virtuous, well, that rules out most men doing Scripture too. She explicitly characterizes it as putting a sword in the hands of a madman. And she repeatedly emphasizes that people aren't sufficiently cautious about doing theology. They aren't sensitive to their own epistemic shortcomings. And her reluctance to do theology, and she's very explicit about this in La Respuesta, that she says, look, part of the reason why I've not done theology so far, she says, apart from this carta that just got me the reprimand, the reason why I haven't done it is because in order to do theology seriously, it requires massive amounts of knowledge. You need to know things about logic and rhetoric and physics and arithmetic and geometry and history and law. Why? Well, because theology encompasses all of these things. That if theology is the kind of, as it were, the master field or the thing that is about all of reality and the deep fundamental structure of reality, then she thinks, good luck understanding that if you don't understand the component pieces. And so she thinks that it's super important that you do as Sor Juana has done, where you read widely and learn as much as you can about God's complex creation. So here's a kind of quote. I'm not going to read all of it here. Oh, no, I have to. So she says, look, theology is the book that encompasses all books, and the science that includes all sciences, which are useful for its understanding, even after learning all of them. And here's the passage I think is very suggestive, which clearly is not easy or even possible. Another consideration demands more than all that has been said. Da-da-da-da-da. All right. So here's the question. Is there an argument for skepticism about then contemporary theology going on in her piece? Well, so first, notice that doing theology is in an epistemically responsible way, according to Sor Juana, requires systematic knowledge of all the things encompassed within theology. Theology encompasses a full range of what's knowable. That's why. But she says, look, it's impossible to know all of the relevant sciences. So it looks like that she doesn't draw out the tacit conclusion. Why? Inquisition. I don't know. Maybe she doesn't believe it. She says, so doing it looks like that what follows from all of this is that doing theology in an epistemically responsible way is impossible. Now, before I try to sell you on that reading of Sor Juana, which I think is, it's not a standard reading of what's going on in Sor Juana, I want to lean on a couple of other things that she's written in a variety of other places. So there's just a variety of skeptical hints throughout all of her work. So in First Dream, which was written only 2 years earlier, the kind of basic thread of the poem is that it details a disembodied dreamer's frustrated efforts to secure knowledge via intuition and discourse. And the ending of the poem is famously ambiguous. Like, this is the kind of thing that poetry scholars can really get a lot of mileage out of because it's unclear how to read the ending of the poem. It's super ambiguous. It ends with the dreamer waking up and the sun illuminating a world with a more certain light than her night's efforts at foundational knowledge. So that's something in the First Dream. Here's something in Ballad 2. She says, look, all people have opinions and judgments so multitudinous that when one states this is black, the other proves that it is white. Later on in the poem, a proof is found for everything, a reason on which to base it, and nothing has a good reason, since there is reason for so much. Then she goes on to say, there's no one who can deny which argument is true and right, since no one can adjudicate, why do you think mistakenly that God entrusted you alone with the decision in this case? Here's a further hint. In La Respuesta, she notes that her critics have maintained that she has no aptitude for being correct. She says the virtue of profane matters is that there's no possibility of getting things wrong. She says, when I do all of these things that aren't theological, there's no risk of getting anything wrong. But then she ambiguously says, and of course, no one's obliged to undertake impossible things. Now, one thing you might think is, well, wait a minute, just because you're doing secular things, that doesn't mean that it's not possible to get things wrong. But here's the really interesting thing about that passage. In the context, it isn't clear if the impossible thing is getting things right in artistic or secular matters, or whether or not the impossible thing is finding truth in theology. It's just, the text is just ambiguous. Now, naturally, you're supposed to read it one way, and it's totally defensible to read it as a kind of remark about non-theological matters. So some tentative conclusions. So one thing to remember is that Baroque norms and the fact of the Inquisition made it unclear if she's really implying any of this. Right? So the text is subtle and complicated and indirect. But there's also a recurring theme going on in here. I mean, I do think that there really is a kind of skeptical theme throughout her work. Whether or not she wants to apply it and push it towards theology, I don't know. Still, I doubt it's a flat rejection of the possibility of theology in Sor Juana. So one version of this is to say, aha, see, I knew it. Sor Juana's totally skeptical about theology. But I actually don't think that's what's going on. I think there's lots of earnest defenses of the church fathers in a lot of her other writing. So here's the conjecture. I think it goes something like this. We have knowing powers of the human mind and the study of the natural world to tell us about the structure of the great book. But the complexity of the world vastly outstrips any one mind's ability to do it. In contrast, though, the church fathers were more proximal to the origination of Christianity, so presumably some theologically relevant advantage. They're closer to the age of miracles. They maybe had the benefits of direct revelation. They had greater epistemic advantages for being close to the foundational elements in Christianity, she thinks. So, what is a contemporary 17th century Catholic theologian supposed to do in that context? Well, I think her thought goes something like this. Look, it's just best to respect the constraints of the tradition. And what we can do, what is studyable by us, is to go and learn about God's great plan by studying the world around us. So go study philosophy, go study the natural sciences, go study all these other things that she was studying, because given that we don't have the same kinds of epistemic advantages the kind of early church fathers had, then what's left for us to do is the things that anybody can do if they use their reason rightly. All right, so we're at 1 hour. Let's see. Should I subject you to philosophical theology? Yes. Axel said yes, and I am like a nun. Okay, so I'm just going to obey. All right, so here's the one. We'll finish up by talking a little bit about the Carta Atenagórica. And this was her criticism of Vieiras' sermon. And the Carta Atenagórica is, so far as I can tell, almost never carefully studied by at least Anglophone philosophers. And it's super interesting. And I think when it has been studied, people don't tend to be tracking some of what Sor Juana's up to in the piece, I think. So here I want to focus a little bit on the essay that got her that triggered the whole the reply from Sor Filotea and then the reply from Sor Juana. Right? So I want to look at the thing that got her into trouble in the first place. Now, this is super important to note about that piece. There's just a lot of really good insults in it. I mean, it's another delightful bit of Sor Juana just casting aspersions on everybody around her. In the context, it's clear Sor Juana is the smartest person in the Americas at that time. She knows it, and everybody else knows it. And she's sometimes completely unapologetic about this, and it's super delightful. So she says, this is at the very beginning, the outset of her discussion about Vieiras' defense of a new way of thinking about something that goes in conflict with a variety of church fathers. And she says, there's not so much to admire in the beauty of a structure built on a solid foundation as there is to admire in one built on a weak foundation. Right? There's more to admire about a weak argument. Which still has the capacity to dazzle with its brilliance. Right? So she goes on to then destroy this argument that's offered by Vieira, and just mocking him at the outset. It's so beautiful. It's such a brilliant argument that makes no sense whatsoever. And then she also, halfway through the letter, says the following, that she suspects that God is using a woman to punish Vieira for thinking that he could do better than Augustine, Aquinas, and Chrysostom. I tell you, everybody should read Sor Juana. All right, so here's the issue in the Carta Atenagórica. So Sor Juana is disputing Vieiras' account of Christ's greatest fineza. And today, the word fineza doesn't mean anything like what it meant then. The idea here is just demonstration of love. Now, this is a total in-house Catholic theology debate, and I'm going to just put it to one side. Because I'm just imagining that, like, a Gauss lecture that spends extended time on an in-house Catholic theology debate would, like, be a lead balloon, and just, fail. Okay, so here's what the interesting bit is. The interesting bit emerges in how Sor Juana argues for some elements that come out of the discussion. So the idea of the compatibility of, one, her claim that Christ doesn't need humans to love him, and two, her insistence that Scripture says Christ demands our love. Right, so Sor Juana intentionally puts herself in a position where she's got to defend both of these views. Okay, the argument that follows on this point is super interesting, but I don't think it's always been well understood. So here's what Paz says about this. So Paz says, look, so on this point, Sor Juana comes to a contradiction no better than the one she objects to in Viera. Right? He also says, the demand for love is an impenetrable mystery, namely the dual nature of Christ as God and man. That's why Sor Juana can't solve it. And then he goes on to say, Sor Juana's reasoning here is more subtle than solid. Like, this is the one place where Octavio Paz, who clearly loves Sor Juana in lots of different ways, like, he's just like, Sor Juana screwed up here. This was the place she got it all wrong. And then he says, Sor Juana does not answer the terrible question, why does Christ desire to be loved by man? Now, when I read this in the Paz book, I thought to myself, that's very strange. Because either I have a terrible translation of Sor Juana, or she does answer the question. Here's what she says. Christ wants both the love he has for us and the benefit of our love for all of our sakes. And then she goes on to explain why. She says, she says, it is selfless because Christ receives nothing from it. However, we get benefits from our loving him. That's why he wants us to love him. It's for our sakes. Right? So here's the rough analogy of the kind of argument that she's running. I don't think it's perfect, but it gives you some sense about what the idea is. So here's the thing you could want. Right? You could think, I really want my child to love me, not for my own ego's sake, but because I think it's super important that kids stand in loving relationships with their parents and with their authorities. And yeah, it might be true that I could get those sorts of benefits, but that's not why I want it for my kids. I want my kids to be in loving, healthy relationships with parental people or family members or important authority figures in their life. And that kind of love is a selfless love, right? That is a selfless desire that your kid love you, or maybe not you, but somebody else, but to be in that kind of relationship. I think that's roughly proximal to the idea that Sor Juana runs. And then comes the kind of theological machinery that I'll just gesture at really quickly. Loving Christ, she thinks, is our supreme good. And, you know, a big surprise, she's Catholic, you might have heard. Loving Christ is a kind of master norm, she thinks. This part I think is actually interesting. She says, loving Christ is a master norm. It orients your psychology around God's commands. That is, it orients your psychology around ethical norms. And she says, this fact produces a human-to-human good. If we love him, that is, love Christ, then we have an additional motivational force to follow his precepts. Right? Because imagine you didn't love Christ, but then like these ethical rules. You could follow those ethical rules, but you're more likely to do so if you love Christ and recognize a command to follow those precepts. And this includes precepts to love others as God loves us, which in Sor Juana's rendering is that he loves us infinitely. So loving Christ produces benefits for the individual and for others that are in relationship with that individual. Right? These are supposed to be the payoffs of us standing in that relationship. And on her picture, Christ doesn't need any of this. It's not for his good. It's for our good about what all the consequences follow from our relationships to other human beings that come from loving Christ. Now, for those of you who are currently getting uncomfortable because of way too much Catholic talk here, let me give you a quick secular analogy, and then this will relieve the pressure. Suppose you thought that the highest human good is found in the moral law. Suppose you thought that our acting out of love for the moral law has benefits for us quite apart from whether the moral law is totally indifferent about us and whether we care about the moral law. And suppose that among those benefits, love of the moral law produces in us deeper commitments to our fellow human beings. You might think love for the moral law is a kind of unifying and enabling feature for the possibility of moral equality. I don't know who would have said that view, but my suspicion is they were after Sor Juana. Sor Juana's positive view. Okay, so here's the last bit I'll hit you with. Sor Juana concludes the Carta with a positive view about God's demonstration of love for us. And this is a super interesting piece I don't think I've seen elsewhere. So maybe some of you who know more about the history of scholastic thought than I do can tell me that I'm wrong to think this is original in Sor Juana. But it's very interesting. So she runs this idea. This is that at the very end of the piece, this is like an appendix she attaches, and she says, oh, by the way, here's what I think. She says, what I think is that the church fathers were all right, that Viera was wrong, that Viera was stupid to think he could do better than the church fathers. But let me tell you a story that I think is totally compatible with what the church fathers said. And so here's the story she says. The greatest fineza is negative benefits. The benefits he omits bestowing. Now, this is very interesting and very puzzling initially to figure out what the heck she's on about. But here's what she says. She says, look, God has to repress his torrents of immense generosity. He's just like a, out of control river of love for human beings on the Catholic model here. And what he does out of this love when giving us what we want, for him, it would be very natural for him to give us all the things we want: good health, happy relationships, affluence, all sorts of things. But the problem is when we would use it to our detriment, or we'd be ungrateful about it, or we'd have trouble reciprocating, it wouldn't be a benefit to give it to us, because we're going to screw up using it. Now notice, this is not screw up using it, that somehow this would take away our free will. Rather, the thought here looks like it's something like, no, the problem precisely is we have free will, and sometimes we're going to use it badly. And one of the coolest things that God can do for us is not give you the things that would tempt you to use your free will badly. You're going to use your free will badly sometimes anyway, but at least he's not making you look bad by giving you even more opportunities to be an ungrateful person. So upshots. The negative benefit picture, I think, is an original view in the intellectual tradition within which she works. I think the view, for those of you who are interested in contemporary philosophical theology, talking with some friends who work on those kinds of things, they tell me that there are these interesting possibilities about whether or not you could use resources like this to address things like the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness. So the problem of divine hiddenness is just, why would an all-powerful, all-loving God leave room for human doubt? And so this is it's a hot topic in contemporary philosophical theology. And I think, the Sor Juana kind of story, you might think, well, maybe there's a way to spin the divine hiddenness story in that way. So here's the big claim. The implausibility of my readings aside, I think that you should think that Sor Juana is a rich philosophical resource, and that gets us to the end.
Thank you, Moises. Thank you for a great talk again, Manuel. Now, my question concerns two of the points that you highlighted in your lecture. The first is the fact that, as you mentioned, Sor Juana makes the case in La Respuesta that she has this overpowering intellectual urge that has been put by God into her. And the second point that you made is that in the Carta Tenagórica, she points out that loving Christ is basically a kind of master norm that basically orients psychology. And my question is whether these are basically, in a sense, two sides of the same coin, insofar as there is a passage in La Respuesta where she basically draws an analogy between her and Peter during the episode of the denial, and how Peter, despite basically loving Christ, is basically forced to deny that he knows him when he's asked by the Roman soldier whether he has any knowledge of him. And so I'm wondering if basically loving Christ and basically, in her case, loving knowledge are basically just two manifestations of one and the same passion or impulse.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I don't know the answer. I think so I'm not sure how deep those parallels go. I mean, there's some sense in which, of course, it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, this is somebody who's lives in a convent and is theologically sophisticated, and there's a kind of systematicity to her work that is not obvious at first pass, but then as you start to dig in, you see these recurring themes and so on. So I take it nothing I've said here is inconsistent with that, but I don't know that. I don't know. I can't. I'm not sure whether or not that's what's going on, but I grant that. Yeah, that might be the case, that there's a parallel argument here.
Right. Can I have a just quick follow-up? Because if you can basically run the parallel, you could basically make the point that just as basically loving Christ is a natural inclination that everybody has, so is basically loving and desiring basically knowledge.
Yeah, though it's interesting that she's very. In some sense, this does suggest a kind of disanalogy, though, because she almost never suggests that everybody's got a drive to do the kind of academic and scholarly and experimental work that she's interested in. I mean, because that's part of what makes it look pathological in her case, is that other folks didn't have the same kind of off-the-charts drive to learn. They weren't inclined to do the sort of self-disciplining she reports. They weren't inclined to go and try to dress up to be able to sneak into the university. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff that she did that she highlights as reason to think that she thinks her drive to do these things is different than others. But here I want to be careful about this, because I think she thinks both things simultaneously. That is, she thinks there's some sense in which it's unusual to have the kind of drive to knowledge that she has, but there's another sense in which I think she thinks, yeah, but it's not unique to her. That there have been other women for whom this is true too, but we have tended to delete them out from our histories. We've tended to ignore the role they've played, and presumably there might be more lurking around here and now, but it might, we wouldn't know it, or it would be hard to know.
Okay. Thanks.
Bueno, recuerden que también pueden preguntar en español si quieren. Aurora.
Thank you so much for the talk, and especially because to highlight the epistemic feminist issues in Sor Juana, and because of that, I want to point to some kind of tension between Redondilla 92 and Carta Atenagórica, because it's very interesting how in Redondilla 92, and I have never seen that before, Sor Juana explained slut shaming, basically, which is still a problem nowadays. But I found kind of, in this view about slut shaming and discrimination and this this hypocrisy towards sexuality of woman, I found the interpretation of the answer kind of unsatisfactory to me, because it seems that slut shaming must to be tolerated. That is my interpretation. We have to be customized by that, because it's the social construction of our gender, instead of be a more liberatory or I don't know how to explain this. Instead of being more revolutionary, once we point out this kind of oppression toward this select group of individuals. And this kind of unsatisfactory answer I also kind of see in Carta Atenagórica regards to the love of God. I think you said by the end we have to respect the constraint of traditions, because we must love moral law, or we must love God's love because of our own sake. We cannot rebel against that. And I think I found that kind of similar in your talk, but it's interesting because this is also a tension with the specific the interpretation of epistemology, the feminist epistemology and social epistemology in en la Carta, because we must, it could be interpreted that she aims us to educate women, to revisit the tradition and not highlight the aims to women to be educated by themselves. So that's my commentary to this.
Yeah, thank you. So let's see. So I do think. I do think that we have to be careful when we read Sor Juana about trying to be faithful to the complexity of Sor Juana, because I think, she's written so much stuff and is so like many of the best and most interesting writers, so subtle and complicated, and there are passages over here that suggest something that's not quite the same thing as over here, and maybe in tension, but then if you spend time with them, then it looks like there's a way to reconcile them. So I think she's a super interesting writer in this kind of way. And so it's partly out of a respect for the complexity of the text that I'm inclined to think we have to be really careful when we read Sor Juana about how much we're prepared to attribute to her across the centuries of our own interests. And so I guess I'm inclined to read Sor Juana as accepting that, I think, so she might reject the label slut-shaming because, in part, I think she's inclined to think that promiscuity is bad. And so I think the way to read Sor Juana on this, were I to try to run an interpretation of this, I would be inclined to read Sor Juana as suggesting that it's not as though it's wrong to be promiscuous. What's wrong is that for only one gender to be paying the price for the wrongfulness of promiscuity. And so I just read her as having fairly conventional views about, at least with respect to that issue. So I think that's just a part of the kind of the intellectual and moral milieu that she's a part of, that she's going to want to say those things. Is it in tension with some of the feminist epistemology? Here I want to. I guess I'm big tent about these things. I mean, that is, I just think there's no one thing that feminist epistemology has to lead us to, and there are lots of ways to do it, and attention to the social embeddedness and social situatedness of thinkers is super important. But I don't think it follows from that we have to think that all that all moral commitments are on a par, or that people who are inside the kind of feminist epistemology can't have strong disagreements about the nature of sexual morality and about whether or not promiscuity is a good or bad thing. So I'd be inclined to read Sor Juana in that way, but I recognize that there's distinguished disagreement about whether or not that's the right way to read Sor Juana. On the second part about, you're gonna have to remind me I'm fading here. The theology bit.
Respect the constraints of tradition.
Oh, right. Yeah, the respect and the constraints of tradition. So, I guess I think that Sor Juana really is committed to a kind of traditionalism, and I think that's true in both of these cases. She's committed to traditional sexual morality, but in a gender equalized way, and I think she's committed to traditional theology, but in a gender equalized way. And then what she thinks is, but here's what's gone wrong, is that we have kept women from being parts of those. So we have kept women from having equal access to those endeavors, and when women have done it, and she thinks they have, we've erased them from the tradition. And so I think that's the sense in which she thinks of herself as, no, I'm operating out of a tradition. There's a tradition of women doing theology. And she thinks, look, in as much as we're tradition bound and in as much as we take seriously the constraints of tradition, this is why she loves to cite that, Jerome, the founder of her order, was a big enthusiast about women's learning. And so she just thinks, look, this is part of the tradition, but it's part of the tradition we've ignored. And so I think that's the way I'm inclined to read her.
Alfonso.
Thank you. So I was wondering just how committed you are to the skeptical reading of Sor Juana. And I was wondering especially whether you would be open to a weaker reading in which he's merely pointing out maybe towards some epistemic modesty, in the sense that, it is very difficult to know all the things that you need to know to do theology. So then one should be more cautious in engaging in theology. And in particular, I think this might be connected to the idea that you mentioned before with respect to the idea that if Aristotle had cooked, he would have written much more. In the sense that it seems that not even Aristotle knew everything there was to know about the natural world. So maybe, I was just wondering whether you would be open to a less strong reading of that passage.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And so I don't know what to make of this. So part of the reason why I wanted to talk about it was because it just seems to me that at least the parts of the secondary literature I'm familiar with. And here I won't pretend that I know all of the secondary literature, because the secondary literature on Sor Juana is enormous and spans multiple languages, and not just Spanish and English. I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done on Sor Juana, so I can't pretend to have read everything. But I guess I think that this is a very interesting and curious thread that shows up in a bunch of her work, and so partly it's an invitation for other folks to think about exactly how far does this argument go. What's a faithful reading of Sor Juana's view? What's a faithful reading of the content independent of the particulars of Sor Juana's own commitments? And so these are, in some sense, I put it in front of all of you to tell me what you think the most plausible version of these things turns out to be. I'm happy to, as Sor Juana tells us, we should be collaborative in our learning. So I'm open-ended about this. Now, that said, I guess I think I'm inclined to read her as at least committed to the modest reading that you were suggesting. So she has to be committed to at least that much, that we have to be very careful about doing theology. And she's very explicit about this. I mean, she just repeatedly suggests that theology is hard, it requires knowing a lot, and that very few people are in a position to do this. And I mean, she's even got this great snarky remark about, and the reason why Protestantism happened was because the Catholic Church wasn't being careful enough about who got to do theology, and then we ended up with Luther. So I mean, I think she is a kind of skeptic about whether or not the theological work of her time is very often very good, and I think she just thinks it's most often not very good. So I think she's got to be committed to that. The question is whether or not she's committed to a stronger version of the view, or whether or not she just thinks, or whether she thinks, is it that maybe we can do theology now, but it's just super hard, but it's doable, or does she think, actually, it's so hard such as to be not even worth trying to do now, and that the best we can do to understand God's providential plan is to go and study the natural world. That I think is just not clear, and it's not settled by the text. And I mean, you might even think about what it would take to settle that in the text. Whatever it is that would have taken it to settle that issue in the text, my suspicion is that would have been enough to settle her into an inquisitor cell. So I don't know.
Gustavo.
Thank you. So it has been a long time since I read La Respuesta and also Octavio Paz's book on Sor Juana. But there's a topic that I kind of miss in the list of philosophical topics you mentioned. And if I remember well, one of the main arguments in Octavio Paz's book is an argument in favor of intellectual freedom, individual freedom also, especially in front of an authoritarian state. Knowing Paz's work, you know that he's also drawing a line and like a parallel between Sor Juana's situation in the 17th century in New Spain, and also the situation of intellectuals in the 20th century in front of authoritarian regimes. So I don't know to what extent Paz's reading of Sor Juana, to what extent he's seeing much more in La Respuesta than what is actually in there in terms of a defense of intellectual freedom. And I wonder if his reading is not in a way anachronical, and he wants to project something that is not really there, that Sor Juana is not really arguing what Paz claims is there in La Respuesta.
Yeah, I suppose that if I put a slide up where I'm criticizing Paz, I invite people asking me to criticize Paz further. So, déjame en paz. So here's what I think. So I mean, let me insert the requisite caveat. I'm totally open to being talked out of the following assessment and reading. So if you've got some compelling reason why this can't be right, I'm all ears. But I guess I think something like this. So I don't think it's crazy for Paz to have read Sor Juana in that way, because I do think there is something very much like a norm of intellectual freedom that she's defending. What I do think is anachronistic about it is how far that norm for intellectual learning goes. Because I do think Sor Juana is a traditionalist. I mean, I do think she takes pretty seriously. I mean, if you read through any of her things when she's writing about theological issues, I mean, along with the skepticism, there's some very serious and vigorous defenses of, I mean, the Carta Atenagórica, this is all over the place. I mean, she's clearly enraged at Vieira for disagreeing with Aquinas and Augustine and John Chrysostom, and it seems very earnest. It doesn't have, so a lot of her writing has that kind of distance and the poise of maybe I'm being ironic, maybe I'm not. That's entirely gone in the Carta Atenagórica. It reads very earnestly in doing the theological work. So I'm inclined to think that Sor Juana does think it is very important for anybody who has the drive to learn to get access to the possibility of learning. And I think she's very committed to the idea that we as a community of learners, we as a community of knowledge producers, need and benefit and are only impairing ourselves if we don't provide access for everybody. But I also think it's not as though she thinks that there is I don't think it's quite the kind of full liberal freedom of conscience kind of idea, in that I think she takes pretty seriously the kind of authority of the tradition in various ways. It can be contested, and it can be contested internal to the tradition, but you can't, I think she thinks, call into question the entirety of the tradition. That's how I read her. So I think so if somebody wants to read Sor Juana, and as I know people do, some people want to read Sor Juana as being fully skeptical about Christianity. I think at least in the documents that we see in from the kind of late 80s through the early 90s of her century, that I don't see unambiguous evidence that she's ready to give up on the kind of kind of core doctrinal commitments.
Axel. Un momento.
Muchas gracias, Manuel. I also haven't heard my mom recite Redondillas in a long time, but she used to love it. And so I don't still see the social constructivism. I can see the social epistemology, but social constructivism is commonly seen as an ontological position, like something about what it is for somebody to be a man and a woman. And I don't see that part there. I see the ethics of the double bind. I see the rest, but maybe could you further develop why you think there is social constructivism there?
Yeah, thanks. Totally fair question. I mean, I think so. So here's what I do think she thinks is socially constructed, and it's about the norms of gender. So I think it's not, now there's this delicate issue about if you think the norms of gender are constructed, and I think she's clearly committed to the idea that the norms of gender are. Does it follow from that you think gender is constructed? And I think it's just not clear it's not clear how to go on that question, either for us or for her, because of course, yeah, there's lots of possibilities here. And I think when people have been inclined to read Sor Juana as being more radically constructivist about this, part of what's propelling it is that they have a view under which what makes gender just is the norms about how it's performed. So the language of performativity is one of the ways to get at that idea. And so I think that's what's going on when people want the stronger thesis. For my purposes, I guess I'm inclined to be agnostic about whether or not she's fully committed to a kind of to the full social construction of what gender itself is, but I do think she is committed to both the idea that the norms about it, at least some of the norms about it, are constructed, and in particular shaping of people's psychological dispositions that fall out of what the norms are and how the norms are policed and what the incentives are. I think she thinks that's very real. And so
That's wonderful. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So this is totally related to Axel's question. So I was going to ask you about the consistency. I mean, do you think it is consistent with Sor Juana's previous commitments in terms of her cultural, environment, her being a Catholic nun? Do you think that's consistent with social constructivism? I mean, I don't know a lot of Catholicism, but but I would guess there's going to be some tension between, like a theocentric view of the world and this kind of views. I mean, I was just like guessing.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'll say this. I'm not a theologian, so I'm the wrong person to answer this question. And, but I guess I do think that any intellectual tradition that's been around for a couple of millennia is going to have diversity internal to it, and anybody who pretends that it doesn't is just wildly misconstruing the nature of traditions and human social practices, and especially things that are ancient. And so I guess I'm inclined to think it would startle me if somebody couldn't deploy some of the resources that are part of the tradition in a way that renders it compatible with a certain kind of constructivism about gender. Now, the easy thing to note here is that even if you are committed to a natural law theory about sex and sexuality, it doesn't follow from that you've got to be committed to a natural law view about gender, where this is understood as the performance of one's sexuality. And so that is a kind of standard distinction in the kind of gender studies literature about let's distinguish between sex and gender. Sex is roughly biological, gender is largely about social practices and the outward-facing things that we associate with these kinds of things. And people have tried to pull these things apart and put them back together in different ways. But I think, I think where the Catholic intellectual tradition is going to have a much harder time is with somebody who wants to insist that sex is socially constructed. But gender, I think, is going to be the comparatively easier case. But I will leave this to my colleagues who think about such things to tell me what the right view about this is, because I don't know enough to know.
Rodrigo.
Well, thanks again for your talk. I have a question about feminist epistemology. In that section of your talk, you focused on her idea about you having a social position related to your gender, gets you in situations in which you otherwise wouldn't be, and you can learn stuff from that you otherwise wouldn't. But from the rest of the talk, I get the sense that she would share another important idea with contemporary feminism. That is the idea that the values you adopt can guide your inquiry and can get you to obtain better results if you adopt the right values. For example, equality. I get that from her suggestion that we should get women the resources they need to learn whatever they want to need. And I don't know if this is like a plausible reading. So that's my question.
Yeah, thanks. So I take the question as something like the following form. Look, here's a view that sometimes that people sometimes have in feminist epistemology. That is that values can rightly drive theory selection. And one reason why, I mean, just kind of quick background for folks who are interested in these kinds of issues, one reason why people have sometimes been attracted to that kind of view is the thought that there's just rampant theory under determination. That is, that the known features about the world don't settle which of these theories we ought to adopt, and so why not let values structure which theories we adopt, because then at least we're securing something we care about in addition. And of course, if the evidence doesn't push back, then we don't get it. Is that a fair construal of the kind of view you were asking about?
Yes, but not only theories, also methodology.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I don't know. I mean, that is, I don't know what the right view, what the right way to interpret Sor Juana on this issue is. So I'd want to hear more because, I mean, as I was noting earlier, I tend to read Sor Juana as fairly seriously committed to certain kinds of core ancient doctrinal commitments to kind of Orthodox Catholic theology. And I think, part of that picture is there's a kind of fairly robust natural law picture operating there. And I think a number of people who kind of read Sor Juana in her context think that these are real parts of her intellectual inheritance. So I think some of that stuff is going to be hard to square with at least some places where we might want to deploy a feminist epistemology that is going to allow for theory selection. But you might think, well, look, no, it's still going to be gappy. That is, it might be that, take whatever you think the deliverances of natural law theory are. Those are going to settle lots of issues, but they're not going to settle all the issues. There are going to be some unsettled issues. And then in those places, you can then deploy theory selection or a methodology selection on the basis of other kinds of considerations. That's a possibility. I don't know how we would extract that possibility from the other one in Sor Juana's work, given the parts of it I'm familiar with, but it doesn't mean it's not consistent with the picture. And so I think this would be a case where I would love to see careful scholarship that tries to work out whether or not there's evidence for the view, and B, where it would come. That was the A, and B, whether or not it would conflict in various ways with other aspects of the work. So I would, you should work it out. Let me know what you think.
Perfect. Thank you.
Diego.
Gracias por la charla. Me parece que queda bien claro que en Sor Juana hay aspectos, pues encontramos que hay aspectos de la realidad social que se construyen, ¿no? Por ejemplo, hay algunas disposiciones de algunos grupos sociales y también, además, que algunos de esos aspectos que resultan de la construcción social son indeseables, ¿no? Como el double bind o el dilema al que se enfrentan las mujeres y esta situación en la que hay una distribución injusta de la censura y la culpa, ¿no? Pero en algunas partes de la charla y también en el escrito que se distribuyó, como que parece que hay cierta imagen de la manera en la que se construye esa realidad que parece como simplista desde ciertos puntos de vista y lo digo en particular por estas alusiones a que, por ejemplo, en alguna parte creo que dijiste y también en el texto está que los hombres crean las condiciones en las cuales se distribuye la censura o la culpa moral y también y más aún como que esas condiciones se crean a sabiendas o concienzudamente, como si se reunieran en una sala y dictaran para todo el mundo ese tipo de condiciones. Pero no sé, esa imagen creo que, pues en virtud de todo el trabajo teórico que se ha hecho en respecto de la construcción de la realidad social, es como simplista, pero también ya se reconoce que hay maneras muy sutiles y muy diversas a través de las cuales la ideología contribuye a la conformación social de la realidad, ¿no? Entonces quería saber si en Sor Juana se puede encontrar algo acerca de cómo es que se crean cómo operan, cómo es que se crea los aspectos de la realidad social.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and I think it's a fair complaint to say that this is a kind of simplistic story about a group of men sitting in a room concocting rules and then propagating it. Like, if that's what the story is, then that's not very plausible. So I agree. This is one of those cases where I think where I'm inclined to think there's a reason why philosophers have by and large, stopped using poetry as a form in which to do philosophy. Because I think it's very hard to introduce these kinds of distinctions into the poem and still have it be an exquisite poem. And she is a poet. She's also a philosopher, but she's also a poet. And so she's got to make decisions about how she's doing these kinds of things. So part of what I was trying to represent was the argument that is just evident and on the face of it in the poetry. Now, were we to get Sor Juana, we build a time machine, we go back, we pick up Sor Juana, we bring her back, and we say, okay, Sor Juana, really, come on, do you really think a bunch of guys sat around in a room concocting up rules that were designed to make women miserable? I don't know what she would say. I think there's a version of it that she would say, well, of course not. It's not that simple. On the other hand, there's a version of it that goes something like, what are you talking about? Of course they explicitly do that. Have you never looked at the set of rules for nuns in a convent? Have you never heard about the things that the priesthood was doing to nuns, or that require? There are literally books written by human beings that have detailed rules about how genders are supposed to operate, and the Archbishop of Mexico at the time, famously tore up the grounds of his Archbishop Palace because a woman had crossed over the steps of the palace. So I think there's all of this kind of complexity to the world she lives in, under which it was more real in her time than maybe in our time, that a group of people really did sit up and come around with very elaborate rules about what women were able to do and not do. Now, would that mean that she couldn't accept and lean on the fact that there are also going to be other gender norms that are very real and powerful gender norms, maybe tied to sexuality, that are not just cases that were explicitly written up and propagated, or things that are natural outgrowths of things that were explicitly written up and propagated? Absolutely. I think there's no reason why she would need to deny that. I think she could just say, yes, these things get going from lots of different sources. But her point is, and I think this is true, is that she thinks, maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time, men knowingly are perpetuating these sorts of these choices about whether or not they're endorsing a norm or not, or whether or not they're enacting a norm or not, and that there's a lot of affected ignorance going on. And it doesn't mean that it's always there, and it doesn't mean it's total. So I think she is committed to that kind of view. But I think this is a fair kind of question about, well, exactly what's the level of granularity of the argument. That I don't think the poem gives us.
Hay dos preguntas más, si pueden ser breves, Felipe.
Bueno, muchas gracias por tu plática del día de hoy. Mis preguntas son muy breves. La primera es sobre la postura escéptica de la que tú hablabas, que tiene Sor Juana, o parece tenerla. A mí me recordó mucho a ciertas ideas que llega a tener Nicolás de Cusa sobre la docta ignorancia, ¿no? Y entonces mi pregunta aquí es que, dado su formación de religiosa que Sor Juana tiene, etcétera, ¿acaso Sor Juana no estará como pensando en el escepticismo como una estrategia para acercarnos a Dios? O sea, como algún tipo de, mira, nuestro conocimiento de las cosas humanas es limitado, no vamos a llegar a ningún lado, y deja que Dios se muestre en el mundo, se revele, un tipo como de misticismo religioso. Eso por un lado. Ahora, otra cosa que a mí me llama la atención en Sor Juana es que, bueno, no hay que perder de vista que pues, es una monja de la orden de San Gregorio, me parece, ¿no? De San Jerónimo, gracias, ¿sí? Y entonces, dada esta formación tan católica y religiosa que ella tiene, no sé si ella trate de compaginar su postura feminista, ¿no?, con los roles sociales de su época, con sus creencias religiosas a partir de algún tipo de interpretación especial de los textos bíblicos, ¿no? Porque creo que esta pregunta nos permite pensar a Sor Juana de dos maneras, ¿no? Una como una rebelde, ¿no?, de todo el orden establecido, o bien como algún tipo de reformista social, ¿no? O sea, como que Sor Juana no quiere abandonar del todo sus creencias religiosas. Sin embargo, cierta interpretación religiosa que ella tenga le permite no votarlas por completo. Digo, sí. Pues todo.
Yeah, so we're running out of time, so I'm going to keep this very short. I guess I think there's a lot of reason to not read Sor Juana as a mystic. I think she's a big enthusiast about the knowing powers of the human mind and the discernibility of the world, and this is our best access to God's plan. And I think this is why she, I mean, and this is partly leans on readings of Primer Sueño, where there's you know, a very common and natural reading of what's going on there is a kind of rejection of mysticism as being an adequate way of providing knowledge, and it creates some interesting tensions in her own, in La Respuesta, when she's making note of, you know, Teresa of Avila and so on. It's not obvious that these are great parallels for her, because she's got a very different model about what she's doing, but so that's on the first side. On the second issue, I guess I think, I guess I think there's a lot of you know, there's a lot of reasonable disagreement about how sincere or committed or what the scope was of Sor Juana's Catholic framework. And I don't think I have said anything, and I think I don't know enough to try to even attempt to decisively settle that question. But what I do think is true is that there's a fair amount of evidence that she takes fairly seriously the theological tradition, and that I think the most natural reading of her, or at least by my lights, the most natural reading of her is not as a wholesale rejection of the tradition, but as rather a kind of reformist who thinks the way you make transformations to a tradition is to argue within the tradition, to build on the tradition, to innovate the tradition, but always pulling back and rooting yourself in the tradition in some or another way. And I think this is all over La Respuesta. I mean, you just see, like, on issue after issue, she's invoking tradition and putting herself in a tradition.
Última pregunta, por favor.
So thanks for the talk. And just very briefly, I was wondering, so if you think there's any significance in the fact that she is discussing love of Christ and rather than love of God, for instance. And so just sort of thinking through your analogy of love as love sort of towards a moral norm or set of moral precepts, and how that in turn may produce sort of a love of neighbor that's favorable. How would sort of love as God in terms of its human embodiment maybe play into that? For example, might there be a relationship between how one loves Christ and how one loves one's neighbor? Just sort of trying to think through the picture that she might be trying to get at.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So it allows me to say a little bit about something that I sort of skipped over in the presentation. So, or I'm not sure I said it clearly enough. So one of the things that happens in the Carta Atenegórica is that she says, look, this is a fight about what God's greatest demonstration was for us qua Christ. And so that's how she understands and engages on the Vieta point and Vieta's fight with these church fathers. And then when she gets to her own contribution to the debate, she's very careful to say, look, I'm with Augustine on this, and I'm with Aquinas on this, and I don't have any disagreement with what their view is. I think it's the right view about what Christ's greatest demonstration was, and it's partly tied into, you know, the dying on the cross and all this kind of. I mean, all of these pieces are part of the story for her about why that would be the greatest demonstration of God's love qua Christ. But then when she gets to the bit about about God's greatest fineza, that is, it's God qua God, that is God qua the God the Father, God the Creator. What would be that entity's, or understood, put this way, what would be that person's, same substance, different persons, but what would be that person's greatest love for human beings? And then that's where the negative benefit story emerges. And so I think she does think that there's a different kind of relationship here. Buss reads this in some sense as some kind of very scandalous abandonment of the centrality of Christ. It's not at all obvious to me that that's what's going on. I think Sor Juana is exploiting the fact that, hey, our tradition gives us a Trinitarian conception of God, so it's open to us to ask whether or not that under these other guises or forms of personhood we get different demonstrations of God's love, and she thinks that there's an answer to that question. So that's how I read her on this bit. bit, but I think it's a very natural question to ask. Well, what all follows from it? And she says she says more than I talked about, of course. But it would be interesting to spend some time with the text on the version of the question you're asking about whether more comes out of that reciprocal loving relationship.
Bueno, con esta sesión acaba la primera parte de la Cátedra Gaos. Nos vemos el 12 de agosto para volver a escuchar a Manuel con algo un poquito más contemporáneo. Muchas gracias, Manuel.